Welcome back to Bedtime with Mama. Tonight we are going to read Chapter 2 of the Double Trouble Society. Now, if you remember in Chapter 1, we met our characters, Ivy and Maggie, and they had seen something very strange happening next door at Holcomb House. So now tonight we're going to read Chapter 2, Pancakes for Breakfast. Ivy woke the next day in the usual way, her walkie-talkie buzzing into life, with Maggie's voice coming through loud and clear. Good morning! Maggie enjoyed singing so much that she made sure to make up a song each morning, especially for Ivy. Double Trouble is the name of our gang. Double Trouble is the song that I sang. That doesn't even make sense, Maggie, Ivy said, yawning. Yeah, but it rhymes. Give me credit for trying, and shh, I'm not done yet. Maggie cleared her throat dramatically. Apologies, please continue. Today is the day that we catch ourselves a witch. We'll tie her up with rope and we're throwing her in a ditch. Ivy leaped out of bed and ran to the window just in time to see Maggie pirouette and finish with jazz hands. Ivy laughed and gave her best friend a round of applause. Even when other slightly more worrying things were on Ivy's mind, Maggie was able to make her forget about them for a moment and giggle. However, now that she was at the window, Ivy couldn't help but inspect Holcomb House. She would have thought it would have been a very strange dream if it wasn't for the picture-perfect house that now sat next door, its chimney gently smoking. The woman in the cloak was nowhere to be seen. Still miraculously fixed, then, Maggie said, leaning out of her window to get a better look. Seems like it. I'm going to go and quiz my dad, see if he knows anything about that weird woman. Meet you in half an hour for school. See you soon for the best adventure yet, Maggie yelled. You know, the more you say that, the more I feel like I need to vomit, Ivy said, sighing, as she went to get herself ready for the day ahead. She took one last look out of the window. At first she thought it was her imagination. It was just a little thin plume beginning to form, but then it became more obvious, and Ivy could see that the smoke coming out of the brick chimney was sparkling. It was as if the purple glitter that had been thrown into the fire was getting caught up in the small tornado of smoke spiraling towards the sky. How peculiar. Ramshackle was nowhere to be seen. Usually the cat sat on the fence, swatting its paws at passerbys or angling the purple gem on its collar into the sunlight to shine in people's eyes as they walked past. Maggie always said the cat was doing it on purpose, but Ivy's dad told her not to be silly, that Ramshackle was an innocent, if slightly angry, moggy, and Maggie was only exercising her vivid imagination. However, despite being unsure whether cats had the ability to bully humans or not, Ivy was inclined to agree with Maggie. That cat always seemed to know exactly what it was doing. Have you seen the woman who moved in next door last night, Dad? Ivy asked as she munched her cereal. She hadn't complained about the cereal because it was quite unusual that her dad, Bill, hadn't cooked a proper hot meal. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, he always said. Bill would make breakfast each morning and then head to his shop in the high street. He helped people fix things when they were broke, like computers, hoovers, and toasters, but really he was an inventor. His best invention was a hat that detected the first drops of rain and immediately sprouted an umbrella out of the top so you could stay dry and still have your hands free to do important things like carry shopping bags or hold the dog's lead. Ivy thought her dad was a genius, but the rest of the world wasn't so convinced. The umbrella hat hadn't been snapped up by any manufacturer yet. This morning, though, she had come downstairs to find her father having only a cup of coffee for breakfast. So she had rifled through the cupboards and came across an old box of cereal. It had tasted rather like cardboard. The kitchen window was open and the smell of smoke from next door had begun to seep into the kitchen. She had expected it to smell like burning wood, like the fire on bonfire night, but instead it smelled sweet, like burnt sugar. "Dad," she said, "can you smell that fire from next door?" "Next door? That's such a beautiful house," Bill said, sighing longingly as he put down the latest copy of Inventor's Weekly and sipped his coffee. "The house next door? That house?" Ivy said in shock, pointing out of the window to the house that before last night had been an absolute wreck. Her father was usually so quick to pick up on things. Ivy always said his brain raced a million miles an hour, so it seemed bizarre that he hadn't noticed how quickly the house had become so picturesque. This was not like him at all. "You mean Hokum House?" she questions. "It's a total mess, Dad." "I think you're mistaken, Ivy. That house has always been beautiful. I'm not sure why I never noticed it when I was looking to move here. I would have snapped it up instead of this place, but never mind. You live and you learn," he laughed, a hearty laugh that Ivy was sure she'd never heard before. It was like someone else's words and expressions were coming out of her father's voice. He looked and sounded like her dad, but it was almost as if something else was in control of what he was saying. "Dad," she said, a little worried, but also frustrated. "Before last night, that house was run down and falling apart. There were bats and mice and birds living in it. But this woman turned up last night, and now it looks like that." She pointed even more animatedly out the window. Her father looked at her for a moment, his face blank and emotionless. But then it sank into a calm smile. "Ivy, dear, how much sugar is in that cereal you're eating? I think maybe it's time we switch to porridge or fruit for a little while." He closed his magazine and moved to the sink to wash up the mug, leaving Ivy to stare at him, completely puzzled. Meanwhile, 2 houses away, Maggie was also feeling confused. She was yawning sleepily as she came down for breakfast, but came to an abrupt stop on the bottom of the steps as the sweet smell of pancakes shot up to her nostrils. As she breathed deeper, she realized she could also smell bacon, which she could hear sizzling away in a pan. "Dad?" Maggie rubbed her eyes, not quite believing what she was seeing. Her father, Max, never cooked a hot meal in the morning. Breakfast in their house came in boxes or packets or was simple, like jam and toast. But more often than not, they both got up late and ended up rushing around to make sure they were on time for work or school. Dinner time was when her father excelled. He had a million cookbooks for extraordinary dinners. But breakfast? Maggie could only dream of bacon sandwiches, scrambled eggs, and French toast. Today, however, was different. There was her dad, frying pan in hand, attempting to flip pancakes. At his feet was Frankenstein, their dog, happily eating the remnants of failed attempts from the kitchen floor. "Oh, hello there, Pumpkin. There's freshly squeezed orange juice on the table, and I'm almost done with these pancakes, although it looks like we might only have one each. I had a bit of an accident with a few of the others, but at least Frank is impressed." Maggie grabbed a wooden spoon from the countertop, which was covered in pancake batter, and brandished it towards her father. "Who are you, and what have you done with my dad?" she said, half joking, but secretly wondering if he in fact had been replaced by a clone or a robot. "Maggie, you're getting batter on the floor, and Frank has already had more than enough. Sit down, silly." He threw a sloppy, batter-covered tea towel over his shoulder and began to dish up. "I'm serious. What's this all about?" Maggie asked as she took her seat at the table. "I'm only making breakfast, Maggie," her father replied. "You've never made breakfast like this before," she mumbled through a mouthful of burnt toast, taken from the pile her dad had put in the toast rack in the center of the table. "Well, there's a first time for everything," Max sang, in a tone that sounded so unlike her father it sent shivers down Maggie's spine. "Speaking of things that are happening out of the blue," Maggie said, eyeing Hokum House out of the kitchen window. "The house next door. I mean, what happened there, huh?" she said, expecting him to understand exactly what she meant. But he furrowed his brow at her. "What about it?" her dad asked. "Well, look at it," Maggie laughed, as if her father was the one being silly. Observation certainly wasn't his strong point, But this was a great big whopping change that no one could have missed. Max leaned over and took a long look at the house, but then he simply shrugged, saying, "Looks like it always does." And he went back to trying to dislodge the pancake from the bottom of the frying pan. Maggie's smile vanished instantly. "Dad, are you trying to be funny? Because it's not working." "Hey, I'm always funny," he nudged her as he sat down a plate at the table. A solitary pancake sat idly in the middle. It was burnt on one side, yet undercooked and almost runny on the other. Maggie pushed the plate away. She had lost her appetite. "What, Dad? The house next door, it's gorgeous." "I know. I wish our house looked like that," he said, sipping his tea. "But yesterday it wasn't," Maggie said firmly. "Wasn't what, Pumpkin?" Her father picked up his pen and went back to scribbling something down in his notebook. He was often scrawling illegible ideas for news stories at breakfast, but this time he seemed particularly feverish about it. "It wasn't gorgeous. It was a rotten mess. It was an absolute dump, Dad." Maggie put a gentle hand on her father's writing hand, so he was forced to stop and look directly at her. She needed him to see that she was serious. His brown eyes looked into hers, but there was something off. He was looking at her for sure, but he didn't seem to be seeing her. "This isn't another one of your stories?" he asked her. "Are you writing one about Holcomb House? Oh, I bet the Crowwood Chronicle would love to publish something like that in the arts section for the coming festival. I'll pitch that at the team today, if you fancy." Her father worked for the local newspaper in the creative writing section. He wrote a story for them every week and had gained a little fame in their village. Max was always trying to encourage Maggie to follow in his footsteps, and ordinarily she loved that. They might not be biologically related, but there was no denying she was Max's daughter. Storytelling was one of her favorite things in the world, and if anyone was going to believe her story about the woman in the house and the Crowwood Witch, it was her father. Which is why it was so odd and so frustrating that he couldn't seem to understand what she was on about. "No, Dad, it's not a story. Yesterday, that house was almost falling down. It always has been, ever since I can remember. But today, it's the most beautiful house ever. And there's a woman living in there with that awful cat." "A woman? Oh, you mean Amy," Max said, munching on his similarly pale yet crispy pancake. "Amy?" Maggie screwed up her face in confusion. "Who on earth is Amy?" "Amy, who lives next door. She's lived there for years, Pumpkin. You know that. Now, eat your pancake and get yourself ready or you'll be late meeting Ivy for school." With that, Max promptly disappeared back into his notebook. Maggie stared at her father in total disbelief. All remaining traces of hunger gone, she left her soggy pancake on the plate and wandered upstairs to get dressed. She certainly had a lot to tell Ivy on their way to school. "Your dad didn't believe you either?" Maggie asked in shock as they walked side by side, their matching backpacks heavy with books, threatening to topple them over backwards with every step. Ivy shook her head at the pavement. While Maggie's dad was very much into fiction, Ivy's dad was into facts, so Maggie had been sort of counting on Bill Erie to be the responsible adult and figure out what was going on. However, Ivy had been counting on Max Toom to believe it, seeing as he was so good at writing stories. Ivy and Maggie had been let down on both counts. "My dad insists the house had always been like that," Ivy said, sighing. "My dad insisted that the woman we saw had lived there for years. He even said her name was Amy." "Amy? She definitely didn't look like an Amy. She looked more like a Morgana or a Bellatrix." "Yeah, Amy does seem a bit tame for someone who might have magical powers that could potentially wipe out our entire village and life as we know it," Maggie said. Ivy stopped dead in her tracks and turned as pale as the underside of Maggie's breakfast pancake. "What?" she gulped. "Oh, Ivy, you need to read the legend." For Maggie, school seemed to drag on and on. Her leg bounced up and down under her desk in anticipation. Even when they were reading her favorite book in English, she couldn't concentrate on the words on the page because she kept thinking of the bits of the legend of Crowwood Peak, words she had read time and time again. She couldn't wait to show the original to her best friend. It was only when Isaac Hedges nudged her, sloshing her beloved jar of frog spume, that she realized it was her turn to read aloud. Isaac was a gentle boy with a deep love of nature. He was often found by the school pond, making friends with toads, and the clean uniform he arrived in would always be covered in mud and pond slime by the time he got home. Sorry, miss, what page are we on? Maggie asked sheepishly, looking down quickly at the same time to check no frog spoon had landed on her skirt. For Ivy, however, the day was moving far too quickly for her liking. She was so preoccupied watching the minute hand on the clock steadily slice its way through the hour that she accidentally mixed the wrong chemicals in her chemistry lesson. She didn't notice until Eddie, her science lab partner, and the only person in school whose grades rivaled her own, grabbed the fizzing test tubes from her hands, quickly put it in its holder, and dragged her by the scruff of her lab coat under the desk. There was a dull thump noise, quickly followed by the sound of shattering glass and a shriek from a few other students. When they had peeked over the edge of the desk, the test tube was in 100 tiny pieces, and a strange green liquid was soaking into their exercise books. Even so, Ivy's main concern wasn't the fact that she now had a note from her chemistry teacher to give to her father. It was that she was even closer to reading the legend with Maggie. She knew it would probably give her nightmares, or keep her up that night worrying about the woman who lived next door, and whether she really could wipe out their village. Ivy knew bits and pieces from the legend, of course. The festival they held to commemorate the vanishing of the Crowwood Witch was the biggest event their village ever put on. Bigger than Christmas, spookier than Halloween, and the entire village celebrated the Festival of the 12, and it lasted for a long weekend. But it only happened once every blue moon, so she could only really remember going to a few. She knew that a witch had supposedly lived in Hokum House 300 years ago, but there were lots of traditions at the festival that she never before wondered about. It was just the way it was always done, and she did like the cookies. But she didn't know why the parents in the village all recited the names of their own children, or why 12 names that were etched into stone around Hokum House were read out while everyone bowed their heads. She didn't know why a ring of salt was poured round the house, nor did she know why everyone had to wear green. There was so much about it that Ivy didn't know, but Maggie was fascinated by the legend, and she would throw herself right into the spirit of the festival. She baked cookies, she dressed head to toe in the brightest green, and she always put herself forward to be one of the kids who was chosen to read out one of the 12 names. She'd put her name down again for the upcoming festival. On a scale of "I'll probably be fine" to "I'm definitely faint, how scary is this legend?" Ivy asked, wringing her hands after the final bell went to let them out of school, and they made their way down the road to the library. Maggie raised her eyebrows. Honest answer? Ivy thought about it for a moment and then nodded. Probably somewhere in the middle. You might not get to sleep tonight, or you'll never trust a woman in pointy shoes again. The library was in an old, rickety Tudor building. Maggie opened the ginormous wooden entrance door and stood back to let Ivy in first, but Ivy hesitated, her eyebrows knitted together. Why wouldn't I trust a woman in pointy shoes? She asked, as her glasses fogged up from the warmth of the library. All witches wear pointy shoes, Maggie scoffed. Everyone knows that. Back again, Maggie, said Miss Moody, the head librarian, as they shuffled inside. She was a kind lady whom Maggie and Ivy both adored. It's actually a good job that you're here, too, Ivy. That new book on theoretical physics you ordered has come in. She wore half-moon spectacles that sat on the end of her nose, and she had the longest hair of anyone the girls had ever seen. It was wavy and gray and tumbled all the way down past her hips. She usually wore green, floaty clothing that billowed behind her as she walked around the library with her book trolley. Thanks, Miss Moody, but Ivy gulped. We're actually here to read the legend of Crowwood Peak. Miss Moody looked straight at Maggie and smiled kindly. Will you ever tired of reading that old thing? Never, Miss Moody. But Ivy here has never properly read it. And as the festival is coming up, I thought it would be better to show her the actual legend instead of trying to rehash it for myself. Miss Moody peered at Ivy over the top of her spectacles. You don't know the legend, Duckling? I just don't know it in great detail, that's all, Ivy replied. Well, we can certainly help with that, the librarian said loudly, causing a few readers to look up from their books, but none of them shushed the head librarian herself. Come over here, ducklings, Miss Moody floated over to the back of the library with Maggie and Ivy in tow, humming loudly as she went. Maggie and Ivy tried not to giggle and add to the cacophony. People between the bookshelves were now hooting at the humming and glaring at Miss Moody. She led them to the very end, where a big book, open to a specific set of pages, sat in a glass case. The book was very old, its leather covering crinkled and weathered, and its pages yellowed and beginning to crumble at the edges. The writing was in the swirliest, most beautiful handwriting Ivy had ever seen, and it was jet black and hadn't faded at all, despite the book's age. Here it is, Miss Moody said with a flourish of her hands, like she was pretending to be a magician's assistant. In the old records of the village, the legend of the Crowwood Witch. Maggie gestured for Ivy to hop on the little step in front of the glass case so she could get a better look. With the wobbly legs, Ivy did just that, and after a deep breath, she began to read. The legend of the Crowwood Witch. Once upon a time, the little village of Crowwood Peak sat in the shadow of a magnificent mountain, which had a snow-covered peak soaring to the sky. But in the center of Crowwood Peak there lived a witch whose powers belonged to the earth. She lived at its base in a beautiful house, a house passed down through generation after generation of the family name Arcturus. This witch was kind and gentle. She healed those who were sick, helping bring new lives into the world, strengthening those who were weak, and was a friend to all who passed. Her garden gate, she proved herself time and time again to do nothing but good. But this was not to last. A powerful demon came upon her home and fell madly in love with her, craving her for his own. He was fascinated with her mossy green hair and brown eyes, which reflected the earth's magic that she drew up from the soil and the roots of the trees. She smelled like rain and wood, and the demon became so intoxicated by her that he threw fits of wild jealousy when anyone in the area even so much as glanced in her direction. People stopped visiting and asking her for help because the demon, whose heart was full of wickedness, refused to leave. He planned to take the witch to his lair in the land of the shadows, where she would be his one true love for all of eternity, and where she would be forced to obey his every whim. The witch refused his offer and told the demon she could never love someone whose heart and soul were so wicked and wild. In fury, he cursed her, condemning her to live with a heart and a soul even more wicked and untamed than his own, so she would know the pain of being unloved and rejected forevermore. She tried to resist him, but it was no use. His magic was stronger, and it forced its way into the fabric of her soul and turned it sour. Her mossy green hair turned raven black overnight. She screamed in pain as the darkness tore through the light in her heart, and her head became foggy with evil thoughts. As daylight broke, the kind and gentle witch was no more. What had replaced her was a cruel and selfish creature. She did not want to heal the sick and injured, nor did she want to give strength to anyone other than herself. Now she wanted power. Once the witch had become steeped in evil, the demon returned. He proposed a new deal. In return for eternal life, she would go with him to the land of the shadows, where they would rule together over his domain. This time, she hungrily agreed, but the demon was not finished. He revealed that to complete the transformation from mortal to immortal, she would have to eat the hearts of 13 innocent souls, 13 children, before the end of the night of the next blue moon. If she succeeded, she would gain not just the years those children would have lived, but also the years that those 13 children's would have lived, and the years of their children's, and so on and so forth. If she did not succeed, the darkness would consume her. She would vanish from the earth, and the curse would pass to the next woman born in the Arcturus bloodline. The witch agreed and began to cast a spell over the village of Crowwood Peak. Slowly, the adults began to forget their children, not only their names and their faces, but also their entire existence. It was as if their children had never been born at all. The witch knew it would be far easier to take a child who wouldn't be missed. However, her magic did not work the same way on children. Although grown-ups forgot their sons and daughters, the children remembered their friends, and one by one, they saw them begin to disappear. Under cover of darkness, the witch would lure a single child into her house. The child would awake in their bed to the scent of smoke undercut with the unmistakable sweetness of sugar, a smell that rose from the chimney of the witch's house and ensnarled the senses of their chosen child, who then followed it all the way to the witch's house. That child would never be seen again. As the magic spread, the children of Crowwood Peak would cast out their homes by parents who no longer recognized them. The grown-ups couldn't understand why there were toys in their house when they had never had a child, nor why there were little shoes at the door when there was no one small enough in their family to wear them. With every child that entered the witch's house, with every heart she devoured, with every soul she sent to the underworld, a great flash burst from the house, a flash so bright it could be seen for miles, and a dark, swirling cloud began to form over the roof. But the children of Crowwood Peak fought back. On the night of the blue moon, they grouped together and kept watch under the light of the moon until they saw the witch's chosen victim moving towards the witch's house. The children took hold of their friend and locked them in a cupboard until the morning. The witch had taken 12 children, but her deal with the demon meant she needed 13. She had failed, so as the blue moon sank below the horizon, the spell turned the witch to dust instantly in one final burst of light. This witch had no children of her own, but her brother had been blessed with twin daughters, twin witches. One fact you should know about the witches is that each witch's powers are unique. One witch might draw power from the tides, and when she comes of age at 13, her hair will turn as blue as the depths of the ocean. Another young witch might find her strength from ash and flames, and so her hair will turn the color of burning orange sun. Each witch will be drawn to one of the 4 elements in her own way. On the morning that the witch's nieces were due to come into their full magical powers on their 13th birthday, something strange happened. The elder twin's hair suddenly turned raven black, and her eyes became black with it. She had inherited the curse of the Crowwood Witch. Her father, the witch's brother, who knew of the curse laid upon his sister, was fearful and cast his daughter out without a moment's thought. The witch's sister tried to stop her twin from leaving, but the new Crowwood Witch fled to her aunt's old house in Crowwood Peak. She was drawn to its evil legacy by the wickedness of the curse within her. As she grew into her power, the darkness grew with her, and then one day the demon appeared. He told her that if she did not eat the hearts of 13 children by the next blue moon, she would turn to dust, just as her aunt had before, and the curse would pass on to the next female child in the Arcturus bloodline. But if she could complete the curse, then she could live forever. reigning over the land of the shadows alongside him. The new Crowwood Witch began to concoct a spell to lure a 13th child to its doom. Little did she know, however, that her sister had been searching to bring her home. She wanted to try to mend the broken family's ties and break the curse. The scented smoke spilled from the witch's chimney like a homing beacon, leading the girl right to the doorstep. She tried to reason with the new Crowwood Witch, but it was no good. Too much of her soul was woven with darkness. As the two witches fought, purple and green sparks flew from the house. No one knows exactly what happened that night, but suddenly an explosion of purple light engulfed the entire building, and there was a catastrophic boom that echoed up the mountains. The summit of the mountain split and cracked, and boulders as big as houses hurtled down towards the village as the peak collapsed. This, it was later said, was the evil witch's final act of revenge. If she couldn't fulfill the curse and live forever, no one in Crowwood Peak could live at all. The avalanche of rocks would have destroyed at least half the village if it hadn't been for the evil witch's sister, who used her own magic to turn the rocks to dust before they made impact, except for 12 small boulders that appeared around the house before the good witch disappeared. At the gate of the house, a slab of rock appeared overnight, bearing a prophecy etched into the stone. It read, 300 years she won't be seen, but she'll return to claim 13. The sky will crack, the earth will shake, when the dozen's circle breaks. But when the 13th moon is blue, two sisters, fierce and brave and true, will send the witch to death's embrace and to her final resting place. Later, the villages carved the names of the 12 children who had been taken by the first Crowwood Witch on the 12 stones so that they would never be forgotten. Below the ancient text, a card had been added to the glass case by Miss Moody. This read, Hokum House, as it is now named, has been abandoned for 300 years. There was no female child in the arcuous bloodline to take the place of the last Crowwood Witch after she disappeared, so the curse appeared broken. However, not a soul has dared to cross the threshold of Hokum House in all that time, and it has had no choice but to fall into disrepair without anyone alive left to care for it. The only resident is a cat whose green eyes can be seen glowing with the darkness of the house. No one knows who the cat belongs to, but some say it belongs to the Crowwood Witch. It has been named Ramshackle, just like the house in which it lives. Oh, wow. That is the end of chapter 2. Come back tomorrow and we will read chapter 3 and see what are Maggie and Ivy going to do next. Do you think that they'll confront the witch? Do you think that their dads will believe them when they try to tell them again? I don't know. I can't wait to read more with you. Good night, my loves.